In 1918, I lived in Sequoyah County.
In 1918, my family was living in South Philadelphia.
In 1918, we were living in El Paso, Texas.
I was born and raised in Baltimore.
In bustling cities and remote villages, in the United States and around the world, orphan children cried for their parents in 1918. People of all cultures struggled with the same terrible threat. And within a matter of months, as many as 50 million would be dead. In the United States, the death toll reached 675,000, 5 times the number of U.S. soldiers killed in World War I. What was that deadly threat?
There was many, many people that died. We had just come from a few years before from Mexico, where we were living, on account of the revolution, the Mexican Revolution. I was about 10 years old. I was the oldest, and my 4 brothers and sisters of the family, only my dad and my sister, my smaller sister, did not get it. My 2 brothers were in one room sick. I was sick in the other bedroom with my mother. My poor dad and sister had to be our attendants and see what they could do for us. Influenza gave you such high fever. Mother told me that I thought her black hair was a cat, and I was afraid of it with the delirium from the high fever. People were left very weak with it on account of that high fever. And all schools and all public places and every place was closed. I guess nearly 2 or 3 weeks.
I was 8 years old. We lived near my dad's mother, and she and her daughter and 2 grandchildren were living close to us. And when they got the flu and got sick, my parents, we just moved in with them to where my mother could nurse all the patients and take care of them. At that time, my mother was 25 years old, and she had 3 children. And she was expecting another baby in May, and this was in February, and she'd taken care of 8 patients at one time, very sick patients with the flu, with no convenience, no modern facilities whatsoever. And Mother had to get the wood to keep heat in the house, to keep all those fires going, plus do the nursing care with 8 patients.
My father's name is Tellus for Reina, but he always went by Tellus Good Morning. Good Morning was his Indian name. At that time, he was working in Tennessee for a DuPont company. Every time anybody was sick, he would always bring up the story about how he got sick while he was in Tennessee and how a lot of people from the village that had gone were brought back sick. They were brought back in a train, he said. Some of them had passed away in Tennessee. In 1918, my mother was like just 11 years old, but she remembers they lived on the south side of the village. She remembers that church bell would ring every day, that there's a certain bell for a notice for the death. And she said she remembers as a little girl how awful it sounded.
In 1918, as now, most people didn't think of influenza as a disease that could lead to death. We suffer through the flu season every winter. In the U.S., the flu season usually peaks between January and the end of March.
The symptoms of a cold are usually a runny nose, sometimes low-grade fever, and just feeling a little wiped out. Influenza, on the other hand, is much, much more pronounced than that. People will generally have a high-grade fever, absolutely no energy whatsoever, muscle aches, headaches, a fairly dry cough. With a common cold, you may feel bad for a couple of days, but after 4 to 5 days, you're starting to feel yourself again. With influenza, it's sometimes 2 weeks or more. Really severe, it can go on to cause pneumonia.
Complications from the flu cause an average of more than 200,000 hospitalizations every year in the U.S., and an average 36,000 people die from those complications.
During seasonal influenza epidemics in the United States, there are certain groups that are at higher risk for complications. Young children, in particular, those less than 2 years of age, elderly people, particularly people 65 years and older, persons of any age who may have certain underlying chronic conditions, for example, asthma, chronic lung disease, chronic cardiovascular disease, and in addition, pregnant women are at higher risk for complications from seasonal influenza.
While seasonal influenza is a serious health threat for people at risk of complications, the outbreak of influenza that swept the nation in 1918 and early 1919 killed over 500,000 people in the U.S. when the population was only a third of what it is today.
I was 4 years old at that time. I was living at the Trujillo Ranch in Members, Faywood, New Mexico. My mother was the midwife, and she tended to the people, delivery of babies and all that kind of thing. She used to take me with her to go and visit the new mothers, and I loved to go see the new babies. And I cried because at that time she didn't want to take me with her because she was tending to the sick and the dying. But the miracle about it is that she didn't get it. And according to her, none of us at home got it either. She would tell me about how people would die, sometimes two in the same bed, and they had no funeral services or anything like that. They would just carry them off to bury them. It was very hard for them to keep up burying the dead because they were dying so fast. The one thing that stayed in my mind, because I used to hear it even later, was the pounding of the nailing of boards together, making, I call them boxes, coffins for the people.
Whether people called it influenza, the grip, or the Spanish flu, it was clear this was not the flu that comes every winter. Today, we know that influenza is caused by a virus, the influenza virus. We know that the virus spreads from one person to another through droplets when people cough and sneeze, or through contact with the virus on someone's hand or a contaminated surface. In 1918, no one knew what caused it, where it started, or how to stop it.
They were scared because it happened so rapidly. They didn't know what was going on, what was happening, why.
There were few communities in the U.S. so small or isolated that they were sheltered from the waves of deadly disease that swept around the world. The influenza of 1918 even touched remote Inuit villages in Alaska, sometimes killing every man, woman, and child, or killing the adults and leaving the children with no one to care for them. The 1918 influenza struck some native peoples in the Southwest very hard, too.
I don't think the doctor resided here, but he came from Albuquerque. A lot of our people, older people, didn't speak the English language, so my dad would interpret for him what he was asking them to do, how to take care of themselves. They would work from early morning till late night, trying to visit every home in the pueblo. In the morning, when they got to some of the homes, they would find maybe 2 or 3 people in the family that had passed away during the night.
Every day they were burying people. The church bell would be tolling from morning to evening because of so many deaths.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs sent Dr. D.A. Richardson to investigate the situation in the pueblos near Albuquerque, New Mexico. He wrote, "The strength of the pueblos was not taken with the aged or markedly with the infants, but from the young adult life of the tribe." And this was true around the world. With the influenza that hits us every fall and winter, most healthy adults are sick for a week or two and recover. When people die of the flu, it's almost always the very young and the very old. But the influenza of 1918 was not only much more lethal than seasonal flu, the death rate was very high among young adults. Strong young men and women working to support and care for their families.
My parents came to this country from Romania, Bessarabia. In 1918, my family was living in South Philadelphia. I think it was a neighborhood mostly of immigrants. It was a hard life. It was a rough life. My mother and father and my two sisters all had the flu. It was a very sad period. There was like a sadness over the city. When you looked out, you saw hardly anybody walking around. People stayed in their houses because they were afraid. And they said that it seems that if it killed you, it did it fast. Because I remember them telling me that a young neighbor, they saw him coming home. They watched from the window, he coming from work. And the next afternoon, they saw him carried out. He died.
Of all the cities in the U.S., Philadelphia had one of the highest rates of sickness and death and the most disruption. The city resisted putting measures in place that might have limited the spread of the flu. Measures such as prohibiting public gatherings where the flu could spread easily. The city allowed a large parade to take place to raise money for the troops fighting World War I. Although the marchers and crowd wore gauze masks, many people caught the flu from those who were already infected.